Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing timers, which is a broader category for a few different concepts. First, we have intervals, which allow us to run a callback function repeatedly over some interval, such as every second. We also have timeouts, which allow us to simply delay the execution of a function for some amount of time. And finally, we have animation frames, which allow us to run a callback function right before the browser repaints, so we can run a function for every frame on the screen. So in this example here, we have a start and stop button, as well as we have this div for count, which has the number 0 in it for now. And then we can come over to timers.js, and we have a bit of starter code. First, we get the start, stop, and count elements, so the start and stop button, as well as that count div. And then we add event listeners to the start and stop buttons. So when we click start, we will call this start time function, and when we click stop, we will call the stop time function. So the first thing I want to look at is intervals. So if we want to create an interval, we can call this function that is window.setInterval. And what setInterval does is it takes in a callback function. So for example, let's add an arrow function here that will say console.log starting. And then after the callback function, it takes in the interval. So how often you want the function to run. Maybe we want this function to run once every 500 milliseconds, so this number will be in milliseconds. And now I can save this file, we can head over to the browser, and when I hit the start button, you will see we log out the starting text every 500 milliseconds. And if I click this button a bunch, you will see we start logging it out quicker because we are creating more intervals. I will refresh this page so that stops. And let's come back over to the code editor. Okay, so now one small point is we don't actually need to do window dot here. We can just say set interval if we don't include an object that a function is on and that function is not defined in our file. Then the function will look to the window object by default, so we don't actually need to include it. So now, rather than just logging out starting, let's see what we can do with this count. So what I want to do instead is, let's say count, which is the 0 text on the screen, and we want to get its text content, and I want to add 1 to it. And if you remember, the text content is going to be a string of the text inside of that element, which in this case is just 0. However, because of the rules of JavaScript and type coercion, we can actually just say text content ++, which will convert it into a number, add 1 to it, and then if we put a number inside of the HTML, it gets converted back to a string. So this will actually work. If I save this and come over to the browser, we can click start, and you will see every 500 milliseconds, we start incrementing this number. Once again, I will refresh the page so that it stops, and let's come back over to the code editor. And what I want to look at now is how we can do that, how we can stop the time, so how we can stop this interval from running. And the way this works is that setInterval actually has a return value, and it returns an ID. So for example, I could say timer ID and set this equal to the setInterval return value. And we need to make this a global. So let's say let timer ID, and I'm not going to actually assign this to any value here because we don't have an initial value. So what we can do is we can come down to stop time, and we can call this function clearInterval. And what clearInterval does is it takes in a timer ID. So we can pass in this timer ID. If it gets null or undefined, it just won't do anything. But if this is an ID that was returned by setInterval, what it's going to do is it's going to stop that interval. So now I can save this file once again, and let's come over to the browser, and I can click start, and you can see we start counting. And then when I click stop, it will stop counting. So the interval has stopped. We can also click start again, and you will see it will start counting again. And then of course we can stop it once again. It is worth noting here, if I click start twice, we have 2 intervals running now, but we only saved 1 interval in the timer ID variable. So if I click stop, it's going to clear the interval for the last one that we called, but the other timer ID we've essentially lost, so we no longer have a way to stop that timer. The only way I can stop it is, once again, refreshing this page. So I will do that, and now let's come back over to the code editor once again. Now what I want to look at is timeouts. These work just like intervals, so I can say set timeout. This is once again a function of the window object, but we don't need to include the window name when we are calling it, and it will take in a callback function. So let's add a callback function, and in this case, let's just say console.log timeout. And then after the callback function, it takes in a delay. So let's say 1 second. And what this is going to do is it's going to wait 1 second, and then it is going to call this function. But it is not going to call it again. So while intervals will repeatedly call the function, this only gets called one time. So when I save this, you will see after a second, timeout appears in the console. But it's not going to keep appearing. It only appears one time. And just like intervals, timeouts also return an ID. So I could say, let timeout ID, set this equal to the return value of set timeout. And now what we can call is clear timeout. And I'm going to clear the timeout of the timeout ID. Timeout ID here. And now because we created the timeout and then we immediately call clear timeout, this is never going to run. So if I run this code, we will never get anything logged to the console because of the fact that clear timeout happened before this second was up. And in fact, this is actually still going to happen if I have a 0 here. So I can put 0 and save, and you will see we still don't end up logging anything out. The reason for this is that timeouts aren't perfectly exact. This is true of timeouts and intervals. We will see why this is in the video on the event loop, but the gist of it is that the callback functions we pass to timeouts and to set interval are going to have a little bit lower priority, so they're going to wait for other code to finish running. So this code is always going to run before this code, meaning that if we clear the timeout immediately after creating it, we will always end up not logging anything out. It's also worth noting that clear timeout and clear interval actually do the same thing. So I could do clear interval here, and this would still not end up logging anything out. The reason being that set timeout and set interval share IDs, so they come from the same pool of IDs, and these functions, clear interval and clear timeout, do the exact same thing as each other, but we should use the name that is appropriate for whichever function we were using. Okay, so now let's remove this set timeout. And what I want to look at instead is how we can use animation frames. So animation frames work very similar to set interval, but the idea is that it will run once per frame in the browser. Typically, this will run roughly 60 times per second, but it can depend on the system that the user is using. So if we ever want to run code every time the page repaints, but we don't care how often that is, we can use animation frames for that. So I will comment out this set interval for now, and let's do the same thing but using animation frames. So the first thing we will do is in the start time function, we are going to call this count.textContent++. So we will do this once. And then what we need to do is we need to request the next animation frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call request animation frame, and I will pass in the start time function recursively as a callback. So the idea here is that when we call start time, we increment the time one time. And then we call this request animation frame function, and we pass in the same function, which increments the count again. Every time that the browser is about to repaint, it will first look for any requested animation frames and it will run those callback functions. So every time the browser is going to repaint, we call start time. And in start time, we increment count. And then we say, hey, next time you repaint, I want you to call start time again. And then inside of stop time, instead of clear interval, we can simply say cancel animation frame, and we will pass in the animation frame ID. So I will say animation frame ID, and then we need to save this. So just like set interval, request animation frame returns an ID. So we can save this value here, and then we can make this a global. So we can say let animation frame ID up here. And I will also comment out the timer ID since we aren't using it currently. And now this should work. So I will save this file, and let's come over to the browser. We can hit start, and you can see this starts counting very quickly. The reason it's counting so quickly is because it's running at 60 frames per second. So we are incrementing the count 60 times every second. Then if I hit stop, it will stop again. We can also hit start, and it will start from the same spot it was. And of course, we can keep hitting stop and start just like we could with the timers. Okay, so I will stop this, and let's come back over to the code editor once again. So one more small point with request animation frame is that in the function we pass in, so in start time, we can give it a timestamp, and this will be the amount of time since what we call the time origin, which is essentially when the page loaded. So I could come in here and say console.log of the timestamp. And now we could save this and come back over to the browser. And you'll see when I hit start, we start logging out these timestamps. I will stop it as well. And you can see we have a bunch of different timestamps. And these are essentially the amount of milliseconds since the page was loaded when the animation frame was running. Okay, so once again, let's come back to the code editor. And now what I want to show is just a few more functions that we have that can be useful for using with timers. So let's come back up to the top here above these functions. And the first thing I want to do is console.log out this function that is performance.now. And then we can save this, and you can see we log out, in this case, a number that is 24.3. And what performance.now does is essentially the same thing as this timestamp. So it is going to get the number of milliseconds that have passed since the time origin. So for example, if I put this in a set timeout, and inside of this set timeout, we call the console log of performance.now. And let's say that we want to wait 1 second before running this. Now you will see we end up with a value roughly just over 1000. So 1025, because it took 1025 milliseconds to end up running this code. Now, similar to performance.now, we also have a function date.now, and I can run this, and you can see we end up with this number that is a huge number. And what date.now is doing is it is getting the number of milliseconds that have passed since January 1st of 1970. So this is the number of milliseconds since that date, and you will see we have this huge number here. And we can also create date objects manually, so I will get rid of this timeout, and let's say const date, and we can set this equal to a new date. And this constructor can take in a bunch of different things, but the way I recommend doing it is first passing in a year, so we could say maybe 2025, and then we pass in a month, and this is a zero-based index, so for example, 0 would be January, and then we pass in a day, so maybe I want January 10th, and then we pass in the number of hours, so maybe I want January 10th with 9 hours, and then we go to minutes, so maybe 25 minutes, and then of course seconds, so let's say 10 seconds, and then we can also go down to milliseconds if we want, so I could say 30 milliseconds as well, but we don't need to include that. We can stop including these whenever we want, and it will just zero out the rest. So then I could do console.log of this date, and you'll see we end up with Friday, January 10th, 2025 with that time that I input. Now the date constructor can also take in a string, so I could do something like January 25th, 2025, and I could run this again, and you'll see it will work, but I would recommend not doing this. It can be a little bit inconsistent between browsers as to what strings they do and don't accept, and it can be a little bit hard to make sure that your string is always properly formatted. So I would usually recommend going back to this version we had before, where we use the numbers. Okay, so now we can also call a few functions on the date. So rather than console logging the date itself, one thing we could do is we could log out get month, and you'll see that this returns the month, which is 0. And this is the same thing for the other values. So for example, I could say get hours, and this would log out 9 because it was 9 hours into the day. We could also do something like get day, and this is actually going to return the day of the week. So it was 5, which is Friday. And we can also call functions to change the date. So for example, I could say date.setMonth, and let's set it to 9, which is going to be October. So this is actually the 10th month because it is zero-based indexing. And now if I log out the date without the get day, so this will just call its toString function, you'll see we end up with Friday, October 10th, 2025, and that same time we had before. Okay, so that's going to be the end of this video on timers. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.